House Bill 5513 by Representative Filippi. Absolutely.
Thank you for your indulgence. I've been just sitting for hours. 5513 amends Article 4 of our Rhode Island Constitution to require someone to obtain a majority vote with an instant runoff provision if someone does not maintain that majority. There's no perfect election system, and I think we have to find the least imperfect system. Currently, Article 4, Section 1 of our state constitution requires a mere plurality to be the winner in an election. Professor Brandt from NYU testified in front of our Voter Choice Commission study, I think 5 or 6 years ago, and I'll quote him. He says there can be disastrous consequences with a plurality election system when more than 2 candidates run. Plurality is essentially whoever gets the most votes wins, even if you don't get over 50%. The most extreme example would be if 10 people run for a seat, 8 of them get 10%, 1 gets 9%, and 1 gets 11%. The person with the 11% is the winner of that election. That is an extreme result, but we've also had, I think, some problems in the last 2 general elections. Our prior Governor Chafee won his governorship with 36.1%, and Governor Raimondo, a mere 2.5 years ago, won with only 40.8% of the vote. Many of my constituents have said that they don't feel that their will is reflected. And as a matter of fact, I don't even think we know what the people's will is when we have a plurality system and someone can get into office with less than a majority. And I also think it's unfair for elected officials because they don't have the strong mandate to effectively govern, which I think comes with obtaining a majority. I think the best solution to this problem is a system of instant runoff voting. In instant runoff voting, when you have more than 2 candidates, a candidate lists its choices in order of preference. If no one receives 50% in the first round, the candidate with the least first choices is eliminated, and those votes are reapportioned to the remaining candidates based on the voter's second choice. And that is repeated until someone breaks 50% majority. Ranked choice voting has proved effective all over the world. Actually, in a matter of fact, in the state of Maine, by voter initiative, it was just adopted statewide. Major cities in the United States have been using ranked choice voting or instant runoff voting for a long time with much success. Oakland, California, 406,000 people. San Francisco, 837,000 people. Memphis, Tennessee, 400,000 people. Minneapolis, St. Paul, 294,000 people. Memphis, Tennessee, 653,000 people. All use instant runoff voting, and they use it effectively, and they have people elected with a majority. It's used internationally. Australia, the House of Representatives, and their state governments use instant runoff voting. India, one of the most populous countries in the world, their president is elected through the Electoral College with IRV, instant runoff voting. Ireland, the president is elected with instant runoff voting. And London, a city of 8.3 million people, their mayor is elected with instant runoff voting. And the foresight of our Secretary of State, I must note here, our new voting machines can handle instant runoff voting. So I think it's an important reform. I think it adequately reflects the will of the people, and I think it's something that the citizens in the next election should be given the choice as to whether we want to adopt this needed reform or not. I won't belabor it. I believe there is some testimony, and this is my 3rd year presenting this, and I know members of the committee who are veterans have heard the speech before. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you, Representative Filippi. Any questions for the sponsor? Representative Vella Wilkinson.
Thank you, Rep. My question is this. Do you have any idea what the additional costs could potentially be if we do implement the system?
So I think the additional costs would be in voter outreach and education about the new system. So instant runoff voting, it's not like there's a runoff 2 weeks later or a month later. It all happens on election night. If there's 3 candidates, you say who's my first preference and who's my second preference, and you mark it. So I think there needs to be voter outreach and education, and that will cost a little bit of money to teach people about this new system. I know the voting machines can handle it. It will probably take a little bit of reprogramming, and So I think the costs are negligible.
And the same with the absentee ballot system?
I believe so. You know,
Okay.
I've been informed that our current infrastructure we have in place can handle it, and so I don't think the cost would be that much.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Representative Shanley.
Would it apply to primary elections or just general elections?
If you would like to amend this bill to apply to primary elections, I concur. Right now, it's just general election for general officers and members of the General Assembly. But I think the same problem of the plurality result exists in our primaries. If you look at a lot of the last primaries, even for general officers, I think there was a question as to whether someone overcame the 50% threshold.
Someone qualified came forward?
Say that again,
Someone
please?
qualified came forward in the last election cycle?
I don't understand your point. I'm sorry.
Don't worry about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, could we hear from Liberty Goodwin?
Yes, I have submitted some my testimony. There's about 4 pages. First page with my comments, 1 page giving some indication of the many places on our planet where instant runoff voting is being used. There are a couple of articles, one on how election 2016 would be different with ranked choice voting. And finally, some comments from Howard Dean on, how it could affect the political situation. I'll be very brief. I just want to emphasize what I think are the really critical points about this. It's a mockery to democracy to have somebody who is elected, supposedly, to an important position, an important seat, when 70% or 60% of the voters did not want that person, did not indicate that they had any support for that person. That's ridiculous. I will give I don't know how people feel here about the former mayor of Providence, Mayor Cianci, but an example of what can happen in our present system is that in one of his elections, he got 35% of the vote. One of his opponents got 35% of the vote, and the third person got 30%. This is ridiculous. He won by 200 votes. I don't know who would have won with instant runoff. What I do know is that it would have been a majority, a true majority of the voters. And I think this is such a critical principle. We've had talk about one man, one vote. It's just as equally important that if somebody's elected, that they be elected by a majority of the voters. And this is a way to do it. So that, I think, is the most critical point, and that's number 1 on my little comments here. The second is it stops the spoiler situation. People should not be afraid to vote or feel there's no use to vote because they think their candidate can't win. People should not be encouraged to stay home because they just think, my vote isn't going to count for anything, and if I vote for who I want, my vote will be lost. And yes, I have a second choice, but I'm not allowed to do that. So dealing with the, quote, spoiler, the nadir situation is important. The third thing is, and the question was asked about cost. Yes, my husband happens to have worked for a number of years as clerk at the polls. He is also the possessor of a bachelor's and a master's degree in computer science, and he's very conversant with the whole system. And I take it as, and he's an honest person, so I can tell you really the cost would be minimal. It would involve reprogramming the machines we already have. That's it. So I really urge you. There's also a question of public trust. I think that giving more choice to the voters, encouraging them, not having them feeling that, what's the use? I think a lot of people voted out of just pure fear or discouragement this year. I think that this system is one that really encourages the voters to participate, and it's fair and right. Majority rules. So
Thank you, Liberty.
please support this.
Thank you. Any questions for the witness? Thank you very much. Could we hear from Jared Paul?
Good evening. This is an issue that's really important to me, and I didn't even realize that it was even moving forward in the state, so I want to thank the representatives who are sponsoring it. I'm here as a lifelong resident of Rhode Island. I've been living in Providence for the last 20 years, and I am an independent voter. I'm not a Democrat or a Republican, and I want to be quick. I realize everyone is, there's a lot of things to...
Take your time, Jared.
I just want to go over two major points. First, just getting the most democratic result possible in an election and increasing voter participation in the state and around the country. And the most, critical or a very critical example that I have is right in this past election in 2016, the presidential election. The Green Party candidate covered the spread in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. There's significant evidence that shows if those voters were allowed to rank their votes, as the representative indicated, those votes would have gone to the Democratic candidate. I'm not saying that because I wanted the Democratic candidate. That's not who I voted for. I'm interested in fairness and in the actual majority of the people determining how a vote goes or how a law goes. Those folks in the Green Party are part of a separate party. If they got to rank their vote, it would have gone, the vast majority of them would have gone to the Democrat, and then instead of the Democratic candidate winning by 3 million popular votes, they would have also won in the Electoral College. And that's something that happens across the board. So almost all major industrialized nations have a runoff election, specifically to avoid two similar candidates canceling one another out and propelling a candidate who has less support. It's algebra. It's not arithmetic, it's algebra. It requires an extra step of mathematic navigation, but it's deadly accurate. And right now, the system that we have is not the most accurate representation of the will of the people. I also want to add, very quickly, the Democratic Party has won the popular vote in 4 out of the last 5 presidential elections, but only held the presidency twice. So the same evidence is there that between independent voters who lean that way and Green Party folks and other folks, the scales would have been tipped. Regardless of how we affiliate, level the playing field, let people vote without being scared of whether or not their vote is going to be thrown away, and allow them to rank their votes. Decide who they don't want in there first. That's the most fair and equal way to do it. And I'll be more succinct in my second part. My father is a Vietnam veteran and a carpenter. My mother is a nurse's assistant. I grew up below the poverty line. And, year after year, we hear, TV political commentators and politicians kind of scold and berate the American people for not voting enough. If you really cared, you would get out and vote. And we only had 30% of the people vote, eligible voters, only 40% of eligible voters. Why are the American people so apathetic? Why don't they care? It's not that they don't care, it's that they don't see themselves represented often in the people who are running. And I mean that with all due respect to the people who are here. My mother is not very political. She didn't vote in the last election because she was so offended by the way things went in her primary that she just sat it out. but she confided in me once we talked about instant runoff voting that if she could have ranked her votes, she would have gone out and voted. And there's many, many people who feel that way. Libertarians, Green Party folks, Peace and Freedom Party folks, Green Party folks, and, you know, as someone who has been an artist and an activist in this city and in this state for many years, you know, I coached the Providence National Youth Team for 8 years straight. Young folks don't feel that this process is democratic. They don't feel like, as many candidates, you know, they don't feel like the person that they want to vote for actually has a chance. And until they feel that way, until they're given the opportunity to actually vote their conscience, even if they know the person they want to vote for isn't going to win because the Democrat or the Republican has more support, just the fact that they'll actually be able to vote for the person and rank the candidate they feel best will encourage them to come out more. And I promise you, if this ends up, this time around or some other time making it to the General Assembly and passing, you will see voter turnout rise every year or every term. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jared. Any questions? Thank you. Randall Rose? Very good, Mr. Rose. Matt Kifa? Okay. Matt was in support. Sam Rubenstein?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative Filippi, for sponsoring this bill and being a champion for it. I think that this is not a sexy policy area, and it's hard to get people to understand why this is important, but actually the way that we choose our elected officials is the very most important policy area. So I want to start by making an observation, and it may offend some of your sensibilities, but I think it's correct, which is that in a lot of states in this country, there are two parties that can heavily contest most elections, and people generally understand what it means when they're voting for a member of one of those parties. I don't think either of those things are true in Rhode Island. And I think that that's a problem. I think it makes for unclear policy making, incumbents who don't feel any electoral pressure whatsoever, and uninformed voters. And what that ultimately means is that we have a broken input system for who's coming in, and then we get broken outputs. I think that those things are problems. I think ranked choice voting would be an excellent reform, and that Rhode Island is the ideal state to do it in. Like Maine, which just passes at the state level, elections in Rhode Island are often characterized by third-party candidates garnering large shares of the vote, libertarians in particular. Rhode Island, like Maine, has a lot of people who switch parties. Angus King, who's a senator for Maine now, like Governor Chafee, who's like Republican, turned independent, turned Democrat. I mean, party labels are a lot more fungible here than in other places. And I think that if this reform were in place, it would act symbiotically with Rhode Islanders' natural nature to not be so concerned with party labels, and it would force candidates to spell out the positions that these individuals take in a competition with other individuals with different positions. I think it would be great, as was said, if people did not feel a pressure to do some sort of strategic voting. People who were not happy with the outcome of the last gubernatorial election here may feel pressure to not vote for a third-party candidate again to try to change the outcome, but people should be able to vote the preferences that they want. I know, just as a voter, I'm really, really, really tired of arguing with my friends about whether their third-party vote is a spoiler or not a spoiler. I don't like the feeling like I need to cajole people into voting for my major party candidate in order to get the outcome that I want. I think that people should be able to vote their preferences. So I hope that you'll do this. I actually, to what Representative Shanley was saying, If I had my way, I'd write this bill even broader than it's currently written. You could apply it to primaries. You could do something even more radical, which is just to eliminate the primary in Rhode Island. And I think that there's a lot of good reason for that. A lot of elections in the state are really decided by the primary, but primaries are this ultra-low turnout affair that few people have heard about with, elections. I worked on some primary campaigns this year, and someone told me, if I get 600 positive IDs, we've won. There's a seat of like 13,000 people. I mean, nobody knows about these things. What you could do is move all the elections to election night, ranked choice voting. Everybody says what they want to say. People rank their candidates. You have one winner. High turnout. All the ideas out there, right? I would apply it even to the presidential election. Perhaps Rhode Island could actually attract national candidates to come here and be seen as less of a safe state if people could comfortably vote for third choice candidates. That would actually go further than the main reform. So I think that this is an exciting and important reform for democracy. I think it would make elections in Rhode Island more meaningful, healthier, more robust, would raise the level of our discourse. And I think that this is, again, every time that I testify about something, I'm always thinking of how can Rhode Island lead the way for the country. And I think that Rhode Island could absolutely do that with this. There's a lot of states that have really crummy voting methods. It was alluded to with the presidential vote, but if you look at Louisiana, Georgia, California, and Washington State have this nonsensical system where the top two candidates, regardless of party, advance from a first round into a second round, but you get outcomes where 60% of the people or greater vote for candidates of one party, of 10 candidates from that party, split into very small chunks, and two candidates of the other party are able to get a large enough plurality that only they advance, right? That's a really terrible system. I think that Rhode Island leading the way on how to better rethink that process could spur other states to follow suit. So I hope that this bill will get more attention, and I hope that it'll have your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Any questions? Could we hear from Peter Sabian?
Thank you, everyone. My speech is going to be a lot shorter because a lot of the points have already been brought up by my colleagues, friends, as well as Representative Filippi. We've all heard of the expression majority rule. We've all heard of it. We've also heard of the tyranny of the majority expression as well. But whenever we hear about the plurality rule, whenever we hear about the tyranny of the plurality, I bet you haven't heard of that before until today. Yeah, this is what we've been dealing with since this country has been founded. A lot of presidents were elected with plurality. A lot of governors, a lot of senators were elected with plurality of the vote. If we want to have a representative system and we actually stay true to the idea of majority rule, we would want something like instant runoff voting, something like ranked choice voting. These are synonyms. So I come from Ukraine. And even in Ukraine, we have instant runoff voting for presidential elections. Because of instant runoff voting, we're actually able, I'm not Ukraine anymore, we were able to have the Orange Revolution in 2004, because when they did the second ballot recounts, there's been some shenanigans that people were able to catch on to, that the Russian-backed president was actually, screwing around with the vote. So that allowed people to go out in the streets and revolt. So I would like to express my support for this bill and think of all the positive things that this is going to bring. We're going to have more positive elections because you don't want to alienate the entire base. You don't want to alienate the base of the person that you're running against, because they can still rank you as a second choice. You don't want to run negative ads, so it's going to cost us less money to run campaigns, elections. It's going to alienate a lot less voters. It's going to bring a lot of apathetic voters in, because they will know that their vote is going to count. Even if they vote for that 5% candidate, it's still a statement, and if whoever wins by instant runoff voting, that person is going to have a larger consensus. It's going to have a larger mandate to govern because there's going to be a broader amount of people that agreed on this candidate, even if that candidate wasn't their first choice to begin with. When Maine, I volunteered for the Maine campaign last year, and I would go to Boston to phone bank into Maine to have them pass this measure. And 9 times out of 10, people understood what I was saying. And, it was relatively easy to educate them. I would just bring up the 2000 election. Ralph Nader is still considered a spoiler. The logical option, I guess, for people would be to rank Ralph Nader first and Al Gore second, or vice versa. If we had that system, maybe we wouldn't have George Bush and 2 illegal wars. I don't want to get political. I think this bill is, it's a bipartisan issue. Even if this bill can become politicized, it's a bipartisan issue. I believe that even if you look at the 2016 election, you probably can't see this. It says that 2016 Republican primary election, Mr. Trump won with 44% of the vote. He won the plurality. So this was the first time when ranked choice voting could have actually prevented Mr. Trump from becoming president if people happen to not be fans of his. And then in the general election, we had 5 states total where the amount of people that voted for third parties was actually more than the margin of win of Mr. Trump over Hillary Clinton. It's Florida, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and even Arizona. So if we had ranked choice voting across the country, we're going to have a more representative democracy. We're going to have people who can vote their conscience without splitting the vote, without being angry. I'm voting just because against. So we want to alleviate voter apathy, and I believe that this bill is going to be a great step in the right direction. I do have a couple of comments on the bill itself. I believe it could and can include U.S. Senator and U.S. Representative elections, just like the Maine bill does, the Maine ballot measure does, as well as the presidential election. And the bill also says election by plurality or majority. I assumed in this context the terms are contradictory. I guess if you win with a majority, you automatically win with plurality, but not vice versa. So I'm not really sure if somebody wins by plurality, what does that do to the majority language? But maybe I'm just confused about that. So I believe that this bill is a strong indicator that Rhode Island should be at the forefront of this more representative voting system, and I urge everybody to vote in favor of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Peter? All right, thank you all very much.
I just want to answer his question,
Great testimony.
please.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you asked why it says majority or plurality. It's majority or plurality, tough word, because we're only changing general officers and members of the General Assembly. And so if you look at the second paragraph down, all other elections for city, town, district officers, etc., are still by plurality.
Got it.
I'd like to do the whole thing, but sometimes a half a loaf is better than nothing.
We don't want the perfect to become the enemy of the good, so I get what you're saying. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We also have written testimony from Rob Ritchie from Fair Vote Action in support. And I'll just say, a lot of the examples we heard were examples where Democrats would have beat Republicans. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, Ross Perot was a spoiler for the elder George Bush in that election. So really, when you look at it, almost every election, or quite a few of them in the past few years, probably would have had different results if this was in play on the national level. So, no, we don't take questions from witnesses, Sam. But why don't you come back up and ask your question? We'll see what we can do with it.
I just wanted to say, if there's any reservation about this, you could go in the other direction. Just pass something that would give our municipalities the freedom to experiment with this. As I understand in conversations with John, the way that either the state law or constitution is done now, it would be the municipalities can't really experiment with this. And you can imagine a scenario where if they were allowed to, some would adopt, it would get popular, and it would be easier to do this at the state level. To your point about it could go either way, I absolutely believe there'd be a Republican governor of Louisiana right now. Had this been in place in Louisiana, the majority of votes in the first round were for Republican. the ultimate winner of the Republican that advanced was deeply flawed and was able to be beaten by the Democrat in the second round. But you could imagine with this, the top two would have been Republicans.
Okay, so with that, we will conclude testimony on 5513 by Representative Filippi. And it was a great detour about an intellectual bill, something to think of, for all of us to think about, and all Rhode Islanders to think about if that's something we'd be interested in doing.